let me just preface the next question by saying that these guys have submitted about 8 questions, and we're not going to be able to take them up in this forum. There are some discussions planned over the next couple of weeks where I think they can be examined in detail, and I know Lynn will make himself available to do that. But the nature of the questions come from a group of Russian and American geologists, scientists, and economics who have been doing some work in the wake of Lynn's proposals on Nawapa. And in the course of that, they also got involved in a certain number of studies in the wake of the Japanese earthquake and tsunami, and on this whole question of whether or not earthquakes can be predicted and other such things. Now, when they first conveyed their concerns to me, I actually misunderstood what they said. But apparently, Lynn, the nature of the question that they're posing was provoked by a study that was released in late June, which was a study that was done by a combination of the Scripps Institute of Oceanography, of UC San Diego, the U.S. Geological Survey, and the University of Nevada. What these guys were studying, because they were looking at the question of predicting earthquakes, and apparently what their study was examining was the fact that they had theorized that the Hoover Dam had inadvertently tamed the San Andreas Fault. What they said in the study is that until the late 1800s, the San Andreas Fault jolted Southern California with very large quakes about once every 180 years. But that now it's been 3 centuries since the last really major earthquake. And what the study said is that that they were baffled by this, but by looking at certain sonar readings and other things beneath the surface of the Great Salton Sea, that they examined the fact that there hasn't been a quake in that area that has there's been underground turbulence, but there hasn't been a major quake. And they say that they believe that this has occurred since the federal government built dams that controlled flooding on the Colorado River. Now, what our friends are saying, and I mean there's a lot more detail on this that we could examine, but what our friends are saying is that the people who did the study are saying, well, you know, you can look at this one of 2 ways. Either this water management did inadvertently tame the San Andreas Fault, which has very interesting implications vis-a-vis Nawapa and other large-scale water management programs. But what these guys are saying is that it could also mean something else. It could mean that what's actually happening is that this is paving the way by containing this. One of the people in the study compared it to a woman who was 15 months pregnant, saying that this may in fact be paving the way for an even bigger megaquake. And therefore, they're arguing that these kinds of water management projects may be a problem, that they're not looking at all the factors involved. Now, what our friends say is that they'd really like you to comment on this overall, because obviously there are big implications here in terms of water management in general, but they also pose the question as to whether examining precursor indicators by simply looking at questions like flooding and things like that, might actually be scientifically faulty, and that really the cause of quakes are coming from other issues. But as I said, there are a lot of questions here, but I think you get the gist.
I don't like the whole discussion. And a friend of ours, a Russian specialist in this, has, at a recent conference we had in Germany, emphasized this in answer to a question from Sky Shields and others. But his statement, the Russian statement, is that we are not capable of predicting because we're not doing enough work in the area. Therefore, there's a fallacy in all of these discussions that people are adapting to the incompetence of the practice of governments and economies today because they don't have the means to make a decent forecast. Now, we do know from scientific work by people who are responsible, and it's one of my specialties, cuts in on this thing in terms of physics. What we're dealing with here, and it's an important question, if others don't make it, this is probably more important, because it's more general. First of all, the general conception that we get in most institutions, academic and otherwise, today are fraudulent. Why are they fraudulent? Because you have a policy group inside the British system in the United States and elsewhere, but especially the British and the United States, where the actual competent scientific work, of which some people and professors and so on are capable, refuse to do the job. Why? Because they would lose their job and their subsidies if they did. So we live in a nation of vicious scientific incompetence among the very layers which in the main would be considered competent. Their hives depend upon being incompetent. And because they need money, they need careers, they need access to resources, university status things, they lie like hell. And they produce frauds to say, well, we can go along with you, Mr. Obama, because we're obedient Obama kisses. And this whole thing becomes a hoax. Now, the point here, the most crucial thing, which is what my specialty is on the scientific work, is the human mind is not located in the simple functions of the brain. Now, this is a point which was made very clearly by people such as my dear friend in this area. The issue here is that we don't know, we're not looking at the thing from a competent physical standpoint. The human mind, the human brain, does not represent the principles of nature. The human brain is, with 5 categories in it originally, is capable of only a very limited, cheap approximation of knowing anything about the universe in which we live. Therefore, what we have done, we no longer talk about the 5 senses, unless we're idiots or poor, ignorant people who don't know any better. What you have now, what's happened is mankind has discovered supplements to the 5 senses. This point was made clear by Bernard Lehman in the concluding 3rd section of his habilitation dissertation. So therefore, the problem is that we are teaching people to believe in sense certainty. And sense certainty does not exist. The best kind of sense certainty you can get is in Bach. Because in Bach, you have the implicit principle which governs these kinds of things about the relationship of the mind to sense perception. Crucial. So therefore, we cannot proceed. What we do have, we are able to develop, as Riemann defined the problem in that third section, we're able to develop approaches to the universe to replace and supersede sense perception by instruments, by scientific instruments. And we can use the standard of the discovery of gravitation by Kepler, and the way he defined gravitation. We can use these methods of sense perception like instruments. We can use them in contrast exactly as Kepler proved and demonstrated the principle of gravitation, in which he defined a principle which is not located in any of the instruments, but was located in a paradoxical conjunction of elements of the instruments. Now, what happens now? We come along and we take our 5 miserable senses, if they're still there, and we now use these sense organs, 5 senses, to enable us to use instruments that we create. We develop complexes among instruments we create, and these complexes now serve as new instruments, which correspond in the same way that Kepler defined gravitation to some other principle of the universe. These discoveries, then, are adopted by the human mind as extended principles which supersede sense perception. That opens up the gates for an expanding amount of instruments that humanity defines. Not only instruments as such, but combinations of instruments which have the same effect as defining a universal physical principle. It's never a perfect universal physical principle. It's an approximation of one. Now, to correct your view of the universe, you have to discover new additional physical principles. So on top of this, then, you get to a state where the idea that you're going to be able to determine by instruments of the type we are using what the universe is like is nonsense. And as our Russian friend said, you have to develop and deploy the set of instrumentation which gives you access to this knowledge. So we don't know because we are not doing the kind of work with instruments in space which enable us to explore this process and to understand the universe in a larger scale than we can now. It's that simple. So therefore, what we get is people are trying to make a career in science. They are prohibited from having access to an approach which is correct because the President of the United States outlaws it. Now, so therefore, they're working with an enforced incompetence enforced by the federal government under Obama and by other similar institutions to commit a fraud. Then, in order to try to make the keep and get a record of having discovered something, they fake something up by eliminating things they know they should be taking into account. Now, a Russian friend said exactly that. He said, he was asked, can we predict earthquakes? He said, no, but let me explain why. Because we are not creating the kind of instrumentation and maintain the kind of instrumentation which is necessary to do this kind of investigation. The lid's on it. When the President Obama cuts out all these instruments that we could use, that we have been using, like space instruments, you realize that what you're dealing with is this is not something you can find out by taking a local area. You cannot define a universal principle of physics by looking at one area inside the United States. You cannot draw that kind of conclusion. You can say, here's something we are estimating with these limited conditions, and we're getting this lousy answer. But you don't come around and have big arguments about the difference over matters you have not investigated. So we're dealing then with a great degree of utter incompetence, practice in science under the Obama doctrine. That's our problem.